Volume 2 Chapter 35. When Zaynak saw his brother, filthy, exhausted, and waving at him like they were old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, he knew things weren't going well. My brother hasn't been happy to see me since we were boys. Things must have gone very poorly, but he had a punitive force. None of the nobles would have done this. Even if a village were burned, they'd just take some of the poor from the cities. The closer he got, the more ragged Zaynak's brother and the soldiers with him appeared to be. He looked over his shoulder to the soldier at his back. "We'll camp here, sire." The soldier bowed his head and covered his heart with his hand and wheeled his horse around to bark orders. Camp was being quickly established, and while it was happening, Barbaro came on with his remaining soldiers. Prince Barbaro felt ready to fall from his horse when the steady, weary clip-clop of hoofs brought him up close. He clasped his filthy hand to that of his presently clean younger brother. "Good to see you, brother," Barbaro said through huffing and puffing of worn-out breaths. "Brother?" Prince Zaynak asked with dismay. "What happened to you? You have a tent?" Prince Barbaro asked, and Zaynak waved his sibling and rival over to a white tent with several guards standing by at the front. "Good," Prince Barbaro responded when he saw where Prince Zaynak pointed. "I want to discuss this in private." They rode in silence toward the conical-shaped tent and dismounted at the entrance. The guards pounded their spears several times in acknowledgement as the royals pushed aside the flap. A bottle of wine sat on a small field table with two chairs opposite it. The field table was a simple, innovative modular design. The legs were cut so that a small peg, usually capped with metal, sat at the center, while the table had depressions cut to fit the tip and a hole at the center of each corner depression sized to fit the peg and cap. In this way the tables were easily dismantled and reassembled. The chairs were a similar modular, space-saving design that folded into 3 pieces in the back and 2 between the seat and the legs. The smooth wood would then be given a cushion suitable to the status of the user, and it was at this that the princes sat. Alone together, Prince Zaynak did his older brother the courtesy of pouring wine for the both of them, though he did himself first as compensation. Prince Barbaro didn't complain. He accepted the wine in the silver goblet and drank it with a long, deep draught before smacking his lips and slamming the cup down. As dignity went, it had none, but alone together, the brothers were relaxed enough not to care. "Good wine, it's the first good thing to happen since Lake Hughes," he murmured the last word, and Prince Zaynak raised an eyebrow. "What was that? I didn't catch the last part, brother," Prince Zaynak asked. Prince Barbaro waved it off with a deep, bitter laugh. "Utterly inconsequential, just thinking of a toy I lost." Prince Zaynak's brow furrowed. "Yes, I see. But what happened out there? How many do you have left? What destroyed so many men?" Prince Barbaro cursed and snatched up the bottle from the table, pouring his own cup. "Goblins and peasant trash, among a few others. There were a lot though, and between them and the rest, it was around 6,000. I was outnumbered, badly. Khani is in open rebellion." Prince Zaynak gasped. "A rebellion of peasants and monster helpers? You're joking." Prince Barbaro shook his head. No, I'm not. We've been on a forced march all this time. Out of the 2,500 of us originally, we have less than 1,000 left, and they've been chasing us. Wolf riders have decimated my cavalry, but they haven't been engaging us aggressively. They're tracking us. I'm sure the ones in charge are following us." Prince Zaynak's face paled. "We've got to go then. We need to inform father and the other nobles. We need to put this rebellion down." The younger prince rubbed his forehead and shook his head, pressing his face into his hand. "Damn it, Barbaro. I was afraid of this. You went too far, way too far. Attacking Khani was a bad idea," Prince Zaynak said with exasperation. "Obviously, but wait, you mean something else, don't you, Zaynak?" Barbaro felt the throne start to retreat from him again. "Don't you read the notices we get? Khani is the village Master Gown rescued, and it's the village that Sir Moman defended and made into his home. Sir Moman even asked for it as a governorship reward for service. You've alienated not one, but 2 powerful allies to the royal family at a crucial time, and sparked a rebellion on top of that." Prince Zaynak pounded his fists on the table, shaking the bottle and tipping over his cup. It toppled off the edge and spilled the red wine within, down into the dust. Prince Zaynak bent over and picked it up, and when he set the cup back on the table, Prince Barbaro's face was pale, his mouth barely open, staring ahead. I didn't know. You would have, if you bothered reading anything father sent us. Prince Zaynak said with a scathing tongue. Now what? I came out here to bring you back before you messed it all up, but it seems I'm too late. We'll go back, you'll explain yourself to father, and what happens after that, happens. Prince Barbaro bowed his head. Just get me out of here alive, I'll be grateful for that, but my soldiers are too exhausted to move. We have enough space ahead for a night's rest, and I doubt they'll want to take on. What do you have? 10,000 men including 2,000 cavalry. Prince Zaynak responded. That will do. Prince Barbaro said with a weary, worn-out voice. Let me rest. And then, tomorrow we can go home. Prince Zaynak looked up to his brother's broken, exhausted face. Pity swelled within his heart. All right, brother, rest. We'll go home tomorrow. I'll have a tent set up for you and see that your soldiers are provided for. You just rest. Prince Barbaro kept his head bowed, though he gave a tiny nod and reached for the bottle again with a trembling, filthy hand that shook so hard when he poured that some of the wine sloshed out and missed the cup, and he simply didn't care when it happened. When Lakewes received word about what Prince Barbaro was doing to a girl for the crime of looking enough like Lakewes, she locked herself up in her room and refused to come out. Bastard. 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 She gritted her teeth, tears of rage boiled over. Outside the door she could hear her sisters calling for her to open the damn door, but her sense of shame was far, far too great. She stared down at the table, her fists shaking with abject rage. The day Prince Barbaro had tried to flirt with her, she'd turned him down flat. The memory came back easily because, up until now, it had been a point of humor for her. They say women are attracted to strong men. What do you say, Lakewes? Prince Barbaro had said, staring down directly at Lakewes' chest. The radiant blonde adventurer took a sip of wine and smiled demurely, then taunted him by saying, I'd say that's probably true, but I'll have to let you know when I meet one, Prince Barbaro. His face turned a dark red at the insult, but he attempted to sally on. You never really know a man's strength until you test it, and it comes in many forms. After all, a prince is born to more power than most adventurers ever have, the power to reward those who please them, or punish those who don't. Lakewes ran her hand along the rim of her glass, seemingly very fascinated by the light noise it made. I'm sure that's true, but then, a powerful adventurer who is so offended by a prince that she leaves his kingdom, and tells everybody that she left because a prince with a tiny penis made offensive, perverted, lewd suggestions and veiled threats to her and her family. May quickly find that he is prince of nothing. Why, I wouldn't be surprised if he lost all chance at the throne. Wouldn't that be a shame? The way Prince Barbaro blushed and stammered, while then saying, yes, yes. That would be a shame. Thankfully there are no such princes in Riestais. It made her laugh a little when she lightly touched his hand. He yanked it back, sloshing some wine on his expensive white shirt, and then excusing himself to storm off in a huff. The memory of that day, Lakewes laughed at it many times. I didn't know he'd make someone else pay for it. I didn't know. Rumors had it that she'd been beaten black and blue and violated while being made to apologize and beg forgiveness, all under Lakewes' own name. Unfortunately, Lakewes knew those rumors were not just rumors, and soon everyone else would too. Guilt rampaged through her as fast as her heart could pump her blood. The pounding on her door grew worse, and finally the wood splintered and Gagran kicked several times, sending pieces of wood as thick as her arm splintering and sailing across the room to smash into smaller splinters before falling down to become tinder piles on the floor. Gagran. What the? Lakewes looked up, but the giant of a woman only swiftly walked over, put a beefy armored hand on her sister's shoulder and shot out. You know this isn't on you, right, Lakewes? Gagran said in an attempt to comfort her sister. Lakewes gave a tiny nod as her sisters stepped over the debris and into the room to join her as well. I know that. I mean, I know that empirically. But emotionally? If I'd just been nicer about turning him down, made some excuse, maybe he wouldn't have hurt that one. Maybe if we hadn't waited until Moman gave us the excuse we needed to take down 8 Fingers, maybe if Barbaro and the other nobles hadn't always blocked Princess Rena's attempts at funding a job request for us to bring them down. None of that would have happened. Lakewes dug her nails into her palms. It's infuriating, it's humiliating, it's degrading. Which is, I'm sure, exactly what that slime wanted, even if he didn't want it to be public knowledge, but I'm sure it's even worse for her, whoever she is. By the 4, I'll bet she hates me for just existing. Hero of humanity, and because of my pleasure in taunting that bastard, she got turned into somebody's living doll to abuse. It's still just on him. He made his own choices, Evil Eye said with a bitter tongue. At least we know why an 8 Fingers takedown was never a job that got funded. Prince Barbaro, and a lot of the other houses too. The magic caster tried to sound comforting, but it was hollow and they both knew it. That's true, but still. It isn't enough. I won't be satisfied with just a scandal for the prince. Lake Hughes shot back, I don't know what will satisfy me. But when I know, so will they. But perhaps the guildmasters can start by a general strike on monster jobs within Riesties. No more support for any mission in any province of Riesties until they do something to make this right. I think that's the plan. I was just down there talking with Antsack, and they're furious, everybody is, especially now that we helped bring down 8 Fingers, Evil Eye said, looking up into the angry blue eyes of her sister. That'll do for a start, but if something doesn't satisfy me, I'm taking Blue Rose out of this kingdom, Lake Hughes said and looked around at her sisters with a silent question. They answered immediately, and we'll go with you. Good. Lake Hughes replied, and began to feel a little bit better, forming a weak smile of thanks to give to her beloved sisters. Volume 2 Chapter 36. Prince Barbaro did exactly as his brother said. The tent he was given was beside that of Prince Zaynak, and as soon as the cot was laid out, he collapsed onto it. He slept for hours, and it was because he slept early, that he woke up when it was still pitch dark outside. The chirping of insects and the hovering of glowbugs were everywhere outside. With his ear attuned to the noise, also heard the sound of passing feet and the crackle of the occasional torch. He got up, but put on no armor. Instead he felt his hand around in the darkness until he found the smooth patch of the tent wall, quietly snatching a dagger from his belt, and cut into the fabric. Every cut and tear sounded like the roar of a forest fire to his panicked, urgent ears. Every breath he took sounded like a gale-force wind. And yet he did not stop. He slit all the way up the side, then pushed an arm through the gap. He then began to slit the fabric of the other tent. The throne is mine, damn it. The throne is mine. You should never have even been in the running. You shouldn't have been born. Prince Barbaro quietly cursed that he had a brother. With every cut and sawing motion of his knife he cursed another thing his brother had that he did not. I'm surrounded by people who don't see me for who I am. Everyone is in the way. Well, you'll get out of my way, he vowed as the knife reached the bottom of the tent. He listened with care again. Nobody was near. He then slipped out of his, stepping carefully around the ropes that held the tent erect. The towering Prince Barbaro ducked down, and gently slipped a foot through the tent of his sibling. His broad muscles were a close fit, and he sucked in his breath, thinning himself by just a little, and sliding himself from darkness to darkness. The sound of snoring reached him. Murmurs, mumbling that might have been words in a dream, and the rustle of cloth from a blanket over the sleeping body of Prince Zaynak. The smell of spilled wine was in the tent still. Prince Barbaro took 2 long, silent steps and waited while his eyes adjusted. It had been a game once, between them. I'm the king today. You can be the king tomorrow, Prince Barbaro had declared as they took turns giving one another orders and pretending to be heroes of old, charging toward imaginary enemies. The game went on until their last session, when Barbaro played the role of king, and told his younger brother, I don't want to play this anymore. The hurt on Zaynak's face that day never truly left Barbaro's memory. Was that where it changed? Overnight, Prince Zaynak became a rival rather than a brother and a playmate, and it was never the same. Prince Barbaro found the sleeping body of his brother very easily. The snoring was a dead giveaway. He raised up his knife, spread his feet apart, and towered over the short, fat competitor. Zaynak rolled over so that he was on his back. Prince Barbaro hesitated. His brother looked so peaceful. A little moonlight made it through the mesh and that served as a dim window, and he could see a smile form on his brother's face. Hooray! Prince Zaynak murmured in his sleep. Whatever it was a good dream. Prince Barbaro braced himself, then muttered with quiet resolve, I am the king. He then slapped his powerful hand down over Prince Zaynak's mouth. MHMMPFFF. Muff. Prince Zaynak struggled to speak. His legs kicked against the soft blanket and made no sound, His fat fingers clawed at the hand he suddenly felt stealing away his breath. Barbro whispered soft words to the fat little prince struggling under his hold. Shh, shh, this is how it has to be, brother. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I thought I could just exile you, but it's clear I can't stop at that. So, goodbye, I'll try to make it painless. He then brought his knife down to Zaynak's heart. The force of his blow pierced through the breastbone, tearing open his brother's heart, and spilling out his life. The whites were wide as saucers as the pain lanced through the youngest prince. Fear lit up his eyes as he silently begged with the last of his life's moments for this not to be real, or for his big brother to save him. Then Prince Zaynak felt nothing, and died. Barbro didn't know if his brother could see him. I hope not, though, I hope not. At least he's back to dreaming again. The shocked eyes were held open only for seconds before they slowly closed, and when the body ceased to twitch beneath Prince Barbro's tight grip, the elder brother and now only living son of King Ramposa III, stood up. He crept back to the slit in the tent, then through the hole he'd made to his own. He sat on his cot shaking for a short while, every hair on end, and a sense of loss he hadn't quite expected. How much time passed before he stood up again, Prince Barbro wasn't sure. It felt like an eternity, but it might have been only minutes. Alarm! Assassins! Assassins! Guards! Guards! Prince Barbro shouted. His bellowing, powerful voice woke up guards everywhere and snapped those standing outside his tent to attention. He ducked under the tent door and stepped outside. An assassin! An assassin was just in my tent. He came in through the side. Hurry! Find him! Prince Barbro barked the order, and the clanging sound of guards in metal armor rushing everywhere stirred the camp from its deep slumber. Prince Barbro stood silently outside his tent. A few guards kept on hand while the rest looked for the non-existent assassin. Check on my brother, Prince Barbro said, staring through the darkness that only torches fought against, at the entrance to the tent where his brother's body lay. One of the few at his side broke away, and with slow and steady steps, the young soldier pushed aside the flap of the tent, and found what Barbro had done. The last living son of Ramposa waited for the inevitable. The soldier came back out, knelt before Prince Barbro, and with a bowed head he said, I am sorry, sire. Your younger brother is dead. Barbro didn't have to make the lump in his throat obvious. It was pronounced enough that the torchlight of guards who gathered to report on their failure to capture the killer, danced over it for all to see. By that time the sun was starting to rise on the distant horizon. The false dawn beginning the day, the crown prince gave his first order. He pointed to the two guards outside his brother's tent. Hang those two, they were supposed to guard my brother. Instead, he is dead. If they'd done their jobs right, then the peasants wouldn't have been able to kill him. Either they were incompetent, or they were in on it, and either way I don't need that. Barbro's voice carried the natural air of authority that came with a lifetime of being prepared to rule, and loyal guards rushed to grab hold of the now struggling pair. What? No. No. We guarded our posts. We weren't in on it. We weren't. We swear. By the gods, no. They struggled, kicked and flailed their legs about as four of their comrades dragged them over to a nearby tree, fashioned a noose as they continued to beg for their lives, and slipped the ropes around their necks. My prince. Please. Mercy. We were loyal. We are loyal, they cried out under Barbro's watchful eyes. He kept his focus on their tearful, fearful faces as two men began to haul the long end of the rope. The nooses tightened and the condemned dangled over the grass, their toes desperate to touch even a single blade of grass, and gain some support for their bodies as their own weight strangled them. The gurgling and gasping noises in their spasming limbs joined the smell of their bodies soiling themselves in death, as one final indignity overtook the pair, and within minutes, the strangled duo swayed like branches blown lightly in the wind. The rope creaking as they moved was the only sound to be heard when the sun rose on the horizon and illuminated the day, putting the gruesome ends on display. When it was finally over and Barbro was satisfied, he had the unit gathered and went to don the armor Prince Zaynak had cleaned for him the day before. Looking properly princely, and now well rested, Barbro strode over to his brother's horse, flung his leg over to mount it, and then turned it around to face the host. My brother was murdered by peasant rebels. They've killed a member of the royal family. That is an assault on the kingdom itself. We will avenge that defeat, we will avenge that sin, we will avenge our kingdom. And the first 100 men to enter the gates of Kani, the the home of the rebels, will get 3 hours of plundering just for themselves. Spears, halberds, and swords raised up as the warriors cheered. Barbaro! 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 With that, the prince gave his next order. Break camp, and prepare to march, we've got a rebellion to crush. Volume 2 Chapter 37. Queen Henry rode at the center of her staff. Jugum held up her banner at her back, Nina at her right hand, Nfaya at her left, and the goblin strategist on the outside to Nina's right. The goblin strategist stroked his thin beard and kept his eyes on the horizon. What can you tell me about our unfortunate enemies? The one we're facing right now is an idiot, Queen Henry said with vitriol. Her hands clenched the reins of her horse. Behind her column there lay wagons loaded with captured armor for the recruits she intended to raise. Also, he has to die, painfully, Nina said through clenched teeth. A wise opponent strikes where his enemy must defend, the strategist said. A fool only seeks a battle to win. Nina finished, and the wizened old goblin looked to his left out of the corner of his eye. I had some lessons, Nina answered. I see. The old goblin kept stroking his beard. If what the wolf riders say is accurate, he has another force coming this way. If he leads it, then he'll come straight for us. And if he doesn't? Or if he keeps running? Henry asked. Then we move to intercept him if he tries to get around us, or we start taking villages and towns if he runs. After we've killed the first few noblemen, they will have to fight, the goblin strategist explained to his summoner. This is going to get very bloody, very quickly, Nfaya said with no small amount of regret. Good, Nina spat. The nobility treated us like animals, like whipped dogs. It's time for them to remember something they've forgotten. What's that? Henry asked with a raised blonde eyebrow. That a dog is just a wolf that hasn't chosen to turn on you, Nina said with hate thick in her throat. Wolves? Yes. I think you've just picked the standard for the army of Kani, Nfaya said with a pleasant smile on his face. His voice carried, and went from his lips to an ear, and it became a whisper that went back, and back, and back, through the ranks of the goblins, to the natives of Kani and the vengeful ones who settled there. Wolf King. Wolf Queen. Wolf King. Wolf Queen. The chant came up with every step, and carried aloft in the air until throats were too weak to bear it. For days it went that way. The chant became a marching cadence, and at every village they passed, they warned of the rebellion, and at each one they had only to say the same thing. We've rebelled. Do you think they will spare you? You're dead anyway, go down fighting for your families and your homes. And dozens more suits of captured armor would be filled in turn. Village after village, with no hope to survive the wrath of the nobility, had its young people join the ranks of the army of Kani. And so the cadence, Wolf King, Wolf Queen, was carried on, to the sound of thousands of marching feet and slavering, hungry wolf riders got ever louder. Until they encountered their target. Yup, Nina said, my queen, you were right, total idiot. She pointed her staff at the idiot commander at the center of a new army. We're outnumbered again, though. It doesn't matter, Nfaya said and held up his hand so that it was outstretched before him. We're better prepared than before. Now, my beloved, would you care to address the troops? Henry looked over her shoulder. If he wins, your wives, sisters, and daughters' lives will be like tar, and your own will be like dust. If you win, you'll have your own kingdom. Remember that, and go only forward. Henry raised the sword she could barely use, but clad in her dark armor with a red cape caught in the breeze and standing up in her stirrups with her long blonde hair waving like her battle standard in the wind, she made an inspiring figure. It wasn't much of a speech, she knew, but it appealed to everything they valued and everything they feared. Wolf King. Wolf Queen. Wolf King. Wolf Queen. The chant went up and halberds began to pound on the ground, creating a steady rumble that shook the very ground. How long before he orders a charge? Henry asked. Nina and the goblin strategist looked at the opposing side. Unlike the goblins they led, whose long spears stood still and ramrod straight, the ones in the kingdom army were waving and swaying. Nervousness was obvious. They had little will to speak of. Not long. Nina answered with her eyes narrowing and sweeping the ranks. The prince made his lines long to give them confidence, to make them appear to be larger in number than they were. But kingdom soldiers were conscripts for the most part. They had little real taste for battle. They could receive a charge, but nothing more with any order. He is an idiot. The goblin strategist re-emphasized. Right, so we wait, perhaps they'll run. If they do, we give chase. Henry's eyes swept the terrain. The long dusty road over which they marched had dried out since the storm. The grassy field on either side was open, with only a small patch of woods, barely enough to fit a dozen men in, and in it, a handful of wolf riders were stationed, waiting for their opportunity. Minutes passed as the two armies faced off against one another. From where they sat, Henry could see that the one in charge was discussing something with a man at his side. What it was, became evident when a white flag went up, and the idiot commander began trotting his horse forward. "I'll go forward. You should wait here," Nfaya said, and Henry looked over at him with a furrowed brow. "I told you before, I want to protect the woman that I love." Nfaya gave a braver smile to her than he managed last time, and Henry felt her heart melt, but she hardened it with her duty. "No, we'll go together. Nina, Jugum, come with us," Henry said, and without waiting, she began to canter forward as well. Nfaya and the others were with her a moment later. They met almost precisely between the two armies. Prince Barbara looked down at them with contempt, his face twisted with anger. "So, peasant trash, it's been suggested to me that I let you go home without punishing you. That releasing you to your homes would end all this before it gets worse. I won't do that. But if you give up your arms and armor, and go home, I will hang only one in every 5 of you." "We both know you won't do even that, scum," Nina said, and hocking a vicious loogie, she spat across the space between them, and though she missed the prince, it struck his horse. That was enough to turn the handsome face dark with rising anger. "That was my sister in your tent. I wanted you to know that," Nina hissed. Her gentle eyes were hard and raw, but it only made the prince laugh when he looked down at her. "You expect me to care who she was? Girl, that isn't why a man buys a toy." Prince Barbaro chuckled. "No, worm," she hissed again, "I wanted you to know, because when this is all over, coward, that it was her sister that finally killed you. That it was her sister whom you begged for death, and you will beg." Prince Barbaro's face was a storm cloud of anger and contempt. "You'll do the begging, just like her. Peasant." "She's not a peasant anymore," Nfaya pointed out as if he were making a logical argument in a school debate. "She's a general, and when we have our own kingdom, she'll be appointed a noble title." The prince's mouth fell open at the nearly blasphemous statement. "By what right, by what?" "Because I am King Nfaya the First, and this," he placed a loving hand on Henry, "is Queen Henry the First. We'll ennoble her to the kingdom of Kani. And you? We'll feed you to the dogs." Henry had felt proud of Nfaya many times in their time knowing one another. Up until that moment, her greatest pride had been at the moment of greatest danger. But the present moment left all those behind. Her heart redoubled in size, so much so that she felt her breast could not contain it, and as if it needed somewhere to go, she began to laugh. Crystalline and beautiful, the wolf queen of the kingdom of Kani pointed behind the prince. "You've got our answer, we're not surrendering anything. Go, scurry along back, we've got a kingdom to tear apart, a kingdom to build, and we won't wait on you." Barbaro cursed and spat, and then wheeled his horse around and galloped back to his lines. As they returned to their own, Henry asked her companions, "Is he mad enough now?" "I think so. If he weren't a coward too, I'd even expect him to lead the charge," Nina said just as they reached their positions. She was right, the kingdom's drums began to pound, and the infantry began to move forward. Nina looked behind her, signal the goblin mages. The flag began to wave, and Nina raised her hand up. Fireball, acid javelin, bombard. The spells came from Nfaya, Nina, and the host of casters at their backs. Fire and acid flew in a long, deadly, inexorable arc into the densely packed lines of the kingdom infantry. Men fell screaming and writhing in pain as fire and acid consumed their bodies. The bombardments came again, and the walk became a jog. "Archers!" Henry called out, and arrows were knocked, then flew into the air to land again among the densely packed ranks. Men fell screaming to shafts in their necks, or silenced immediately when their lives were ended by an arrow through the eye. The path of advance was measured in death as the kingdom army's numbers dwindled. A horn blew from behind the kingdom lines, and cavalry began their charge. Heavy horses thudded over the ground, adding to the rumble of marching feet. "Wolf riders!" Henry shouted. Her husband continued firing off acid into oncoming faces, unable to miss hitting someone with every blast. The howling of wolves drowned out all else for a moment, and then the pounding of large paws from massive wolves began to compete with horses. The goblins atop the wolves were armored and skilled in ways that the kingdom cavalry could only dream of being. Though they were fewer in number, the wolf riders began to extract a heavy toll on the flanks where cavalry began their once proud charge. "All right, now," Nina said, "infantry, and sound the drums." The boom of the goblin army war drums sent waves of terror into the advancing, thinning ranks of the kingdom soldiers. Their steel armor could not protect them from their own cowardice. They began to waver with the first steps of the goblin heavy infantry. Henry drew out her sword. Her infantry were close. Her heart was running wild in her chest. Fear was palpable, but worse was the fear of going back. Worse was the fear of losing without doing anything. Last time they came, all I could do was run away and die. I couldn't protect Nemu. I couldn't save my parents. I couldn't do anything but die. I can do something this time. I will do something this time. Her sword went into the air. Her armor was one of the finest sets in the carts delivered to her village by Master Gown, and at a full set, the only places on her body that were vulnerable were her face, head, and throat. "Charge!" she shouted, and lowered her sword forward. Nfia, Nina, and Henry spurred their horses as one, and into the fray they headed. The bouncing of their horses made aiming difficult, but Nfia's acid javelins and Nina's fireballs were nonetheless hitting at least some targets. The clashing and clamoring of swords, the screams and dying of men were indistinguishable from those of wild beasts. The heavy goblin infantry treated war like a chore, like farming, and the kingdom soldiers, regardless of their superior numbers, began to fall like wheat before the scythes. Men fell screaming into the churned-up earth. Once dry, it became muddy with sweat, fear, piss, and blood, all churned up into a morass into which men sank. The numerical advantage shifted, and the goblin strategist gave the final signal. From the little clump of woods, the small number of hidden wolf riders emerged. Behind enemy lines, they rushed straight for the commander of the army of the kingdom. His small honor guard saw the surprise attack too late, and spun their horses to charge and meet a threat for which they were no match. Barbaro saw the horror unfolding in front of him. His army of almost 11,000 men, the 10,000 his brother delivered and the nearly 1,000 he had remaining, was being whittled down by the second. His mouth dropped open in disbelief. He felt his fear begin to rise in his mighty chest. No. It can't be. I'm a prince, damn it. Why aren't they winning? This should have been easy. They're just goblins and peasants. Okay, some nagas and ogres. He acknowledged when he saw the ogres kick dozens of his men out of their formation and a naga's tail smash into a group and send them flying to the ground. But they're so few. How can this be happening to me? Prince Barbaro wanted to pull at his hair, only the princely dignity he still had when surrounded by his honor guard prevented him from doing so. Then one of his men let out a cry of alarm. Ambush! Barbaro whipped his head to where the warrior pointed. A dozen wolf riders had been hidden in a little patch of woods, and were charging toward him full tilt. Get them! Get them, you idiots! Protect your prince! Barbaro's voice became a high-pitched squeal of fear as his warriors turned to do just as he said. They roared out brave battle cries and raised their swords for the clash that would decide the fate of their prince. Horses screamed and died so close that he could smell their fear. A few loyal guards yelled for him to run while the goblin wolf riders tore his guards to shreds. Flashing teeth of white became teeth of red. Claw-like nails on the wolves raked over faces and horse throats, tearing out streaks of flesh to cast into the red-stained grass, and the bodyguards died off. Before the call for him to run had even reached his ears, Prince Barbaro began to do exactly that. He turned his horse around and began to spur it to a gallop. Behind him his army, losing their leader, broke entirely and soldiers ran for their lives, trading their pride and dignity for a precious few seconds of ephemeral life. The battle became a massacre, and the prince alone survived. His lungs were burning from his hard breathing, the horse's flanks were bloody from the force of his legs digging into them to spur it on further. And yet, at his back, the wolf riders were gaining on him. No, he cried out and flung off his helmet to save his horse a tiny bit of the burden of carrying it while he was trying to escape. At his left and right, the wolf riders fell in, almost like they were his honor guard, taunting him, laughing, waving, their wolves keeping pace with the horse of the prince, but not turning on him. They went on, and on, and on, the horse's fear of the wolves greater than its desire to carry its human passenger to safety, carried on for what seemed like an hour, until at last, it reared back on its hind hooves, forelegs kicking wildly, flinging Barbaro from its back, and giving out a single final whinny of pain and fear. Then it fell. It landed, dead on its side, its powerful heart overloaded from fear and stress. Prince Barbaro felt the wind knocked out of him when he landed on his back. He lay there coughing and wheezing without any air to spare, staring at the wolves and their riders that now circled him. "Bring him back to the summoner," one of them finally said, and a wolf's jaws snapped out over Barbaro's leg, piercing the leather boot and the flesh beneath, and breaking the bone. "No!" He screamed and clawed at the dirt, as the wolf began to run, dragging him over dirt and rocks and grass, all the way back to the site of the massacre. The victors were still working, and the commanders waiting, when Barbaro was dragged over the grass by the wolf who still held his broken leg. It jerked its jaw forward and released its hold, and he landed with a grunt and rolled over to their feet. He found himself staring up at the brown-haired girl who called herself the sister of his pet Lacuse. "Do it," Henry said, "but don't waste time, we have a kingdom to build." "Yes, my queen," Nina replied. She put her foot on his throat and began to press down. The prince's eyes bulged in his head. "My name is Nina Veyron, you raped my sister, prepare to die." She then looked up at the wolf riders. "Start to chew on his limbs, make it hurt, but don't kill him. He's not allowed to die till he begs." Barbaro's head shook under the boot on his throat, and then he gurgled out howls of pain as a wolf latched onto each limb and began to tear away at his flesh like his armor wasn't even there. Bits and pieces of metal began to fall away, and with it went flesh and blood. Nina lifted up her foot from his throat to allow his screams to fill the world, and with his screams, her heart sang a happy song. Luku was absolutely right. I'll have to do something for her when I see her again. Nina made a mental note about that as the tearing began to peel strips of flesh down to his bones, exposing them to the air. He kicked and struggled against the massive jaws, but all it did was injure himself more, and the breaks added up. Until at last, he begged. "Please. No more. I'm sorry. No more. I beg you. Kill me. Kill me. Kill me." Nina raised a hand, and the wolves stopped their chewing. The prince dropped like a sack of bloody potatoes into the grass and stared up at her. "Mercy. Death. Kill me. Beg you. No more pain." Nina recalled what her sister had said, her begging, crawling, scraping, the way he made her humble herself as if she'd done something wrong. How she was made a substitute for his hatred of someone else. Eventually, Nina said, "Continue." Barbaro screamed again as the wolves went back to tearing off bits of his flesh. It was only when Barbaro could no longer scream or beg, when his throat had lost the power to even plead, that Nina said with cold satisfaction, "Now you can die, be grateful. It's a greater kindness than you ever gave." Barbaro's eyes still worked, and he saw the open mouth of razor teeth belonging to one of the massive wolves, coming toward his throat. His fear of death, however, was long, long gone. Now Barbaro feared only one thing. As the more began to drip hot wolf drool over his cheek, he feared not being allowed to die. The teeth closed in, they slowly pierced his skin, he felt blood begin to spurt out of his veins and the hot fluid run over his skin, and his head began to crunch as the jaws closed tighter. Then there was nothing to be afraid of anymore, for Prince Barbaro, last son of King Ramposa III, firstborn and rightful heir to the throne of Riastais, was dead. And with his death, a cheer shook the world. Wolf King, Wolf Queen, Wolf King, Wolf Queen. And the green and gold banner of Kani waved proudly over the field.